Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Your title, Efficient Actions in Dynamic Auction Environments. So, what's my call?
So do you have an hour or 50 minutes?
I think 45, 50 minutes is good.
Okay. So I have a challenge ahead of me because it's my second time ever talking to a computer science audience, and I know that some of you are very expert on auctions, like Max and Chris have a very nice paper about auctions, and some of you probably don't know much about auctions and perhaps have never seen an economics talk. So I will try to make it interesting for everybody, although it probably will be difficult. So let me start out with putting things in perspective a little bit. So this paper, essentially what it does, it tries to sort of generalize them, to some extent, Vickrey auction for dynamic auction environment. And I know that some of you are very expert on what Vickrey auction is because you wrote papers about it, and some of you probably have never heard about VCG mechanism. So.
Do you know about Vickrey auctions? Yeah. So I think that you.
Everybody.
We're good. Yeah.
Okay, good. So nevertheless, let me put a little bit in perspective what is the connection between Vickrey auction and other parts of economics, and that would also help us to sort of follow the paper along the way. So, if you have never seen an economics talk, what you would imagine economists do, they draw supply and demand. And I will not disappoint. I'll draw supply and demand.
Literally draw.
And in fact, supply and demand does tie quite closely to the idea behind Vickrey auction. And here's the connection, right? So where does demand curve come from? If the price is very, very high, there is perhaps, and since you're a computer science audience, I'll make supply and demand discrete. So why is it discrete? Because if the price is very high, there's only one person who will buy something, who will buy this good. Well, if you drop the price a little bit, maybe there are two people who are willing to buy this. You drop the price a little more, there are 3, 4, and so on and so forth. So you get nice demand curve, and that makes a lot of sense, right? So far it has nothing to do with auctions, right? This is just supply and demand, and at some price the market would clear. So suppose that a new person comes to town, and he is willing to pay about this much for this good. So then the demand curve suddenly jumps up a little bit because there's one extra person who is willing to buy it, right? Things changed a little bit. So that person is an evildoer. And he's an evildoer because he raises the price for all of us. This is a concern. He imposes an externality on all of us. So now, suppose that there's a factory that comes to town, and they're going to, they're not going to be a nice company like Microsoft. They're going to be in the chemical business, and they're going to pollute our air. So they're also imposing a cost on all of us, an externality, right? So here, this guy, he came into town, he made things more expensive for us. Now the land is more expensive. It's harder to buy real estate. You live in Seattle, you know how it works. Right? The other thing, a factory comes into town, and suddenly the air is not as clean as it was before. So those are two different kinds of evildoers. And most economists would say, all economists perhaps would say, in the second case, where you have a factory coming to town, they create an externality, they pollute, and we should do something about it, we should regulate. In this case, a new person comes to town, or a new factory, it doesn't matter, and they buy some land and they drive the price up for all of us. And we don't think we should regulate that. We are fine with that. So what's the difference between those two situations? two externalities. In one case, we are fine with it. In the other, we are not. So what's the difference? Is there a difference? And the answer is there is. In the case of a factory that comes into town, if they start polluting, they impose an externality on all of us, but they pay nothing for that. They spoil our lives at no cost to themselves. So the answer that economists would give, in fact, a French economist, Pigot, was the first one to suggest that. He said, there is this externality there that they impose on all of us by making our air dirtier. So what we should do to make the world efficient, we shouldn't prohibit them from polluting our air, but we'll have to compute how costly it is for us, the citizens of this town, for each of us, how much of a cost is it for all of us that the air is dirtier now. We should compute this total cost, and we should charge them a tax called Pigovian tax for the pollution. Now they will be paying for the externality that they imposed on all of us, and things would be efficient. Because if, in fact, the value for them for polluting our air is 1,000, and there are 1,000 of us, and the value for us of having polluted air is only 50 cents, then clearly they should be polluting and paying the tax, and that would be overall efficient, right? So here the idea is we have this Pigovian tax, and we make that actor to pay for the externality that that actor imposes on all of us. So now let's go back to this example. Here you have someone who comes into town, and he drives up the prices for all of us. So he imposes an externality. But it's not for free. He has to pay for the land that he buys or for the land that he rents. And in fact, miraculously, it's easy to see that the payment that he makes is exactly equal to the externality that he imposes on all of us. And that's sort of easy to see, right? It's a transfer between him and the landlord, right? So what happened? He took out of the circulation that little plot of land that he rented. That drove up the prices by epsilon for all of us. So it's pretty easy to see that if you add up all those epsilons across all people, that would add up to exactly the amount that he pays for that land. So he paid exactly for his externality. And that's why we are not worried. In fact, he pays the efficient amount. With Pigovian tax, what we want to force this polluter to pay not too much and not too little, but exactly the value of the externality. And the key idea behind auction design and behind the whole economics is that you want agents to pay for the externalities. And I think that idea, this overall idea, is a very fundamental idea, because if you want a bunch of silly agents to add up to an intelligent system, you have to create a design where in a centralized or decentralized fashion, agents are paying for externality that they impose on each other. So I think that's, to some extent, a fundamental idea for emergence of intelligence, if you wish. So I think this is a fundamental economic principle. And this paper is just one of many papers that applies this idea. We want, in various settings, very different, polluter, here, a market with large number of agents, here, a static market, with few sellers and few buyers in Vickrey auction. So what is a Vickrey auction? You make every player to pay for externality that he imposes on others. So what this paper does, essentially, it attempts to extend this idea of Vickrey to dynamic setting. So we'll refer to auction environment where individual values may change over time. As a result of both private actions and exogenous shocks as a dynamic environment. So let me elaborate on that. Let me show how this environment is different from a standard auction environment. And let me give you just a simple, silly example of this of a dynamic environment like that. So suppose you have a military base, and the military base will close in 5 years. And the army knows they're closing the military base in 5 years, and they want to sell it. So, of course, you can sell it right now, because you know that it will be available for use in 5 years, and someone may buy it and maybe turn it into a corporate headquarters or a warehouse or an apartment building. Who cares? So you can sell it right now, and that seems like a reasonable solution. But if you think about it, well, maybe it's not. Because during the next 5 years, two things are going to happen. First, each of those potential buyers for this military base would experience changes in his situation. Right? So for instance, if it's a company that thinks of using a military base as a warehouse, perhaps the business would be going very, very well, so they will really need a warehouse, and perhaps it wouldn't go well at all, so they wouldn't even need a warehouse at all. So they don't know. So there's an uncertainty that's going to be resolved over the years to come. There's something else that's going to happen in the next 5 years. Each of those players would be, if each of the potential buyers would have opportunities to take actions that would enhance or reduce the value of this object, in this example, a military base, for them. So for example, if I am a business and I know I need a warehouse, well, perhaps I can buy another warehouse. I can buy another plot of land somewhere else, in which case my value for this military base as a warehouse would be greatly reduced. I would essentially take myself out of the market. Right? Or I can build my production facilities nearby or far away. So there are many actions that I take. And I take some of those actions before the uncertainty about my value is fully resolved. So that no longer fits in a standard Vickrey setting, because it's still a private value environment. My value is independent of your information. However, there is a problem, because if you sell the military base very early, then the problem is that the person who will buy it, he will take efficient actions. He will know that he will own the base, so he will know to make appropriate investments to enhance the value of this object for him. On the other hand, there is a problem because his value may change over time. So by the time it would be time for him to actually use the base, there may be other agents who actually have higher values, right? Yes?
So I guess I'm not really seeing the distinction. It seems like that here there's just, in these scenarios, there's just a lot of uncertainty about the value depending on the things that I could do and the things that could happen in the future. But how is that fundamentally different?
It's fundamentally different. What's very important here that there's a combination. So in the standard Vickrey setting, there's no uncertainty about your value. Everybody knows the values. However, if you allow in the standard Vickrey setting the values to be uncertain, and just agents would learn them later, that wouldn't make any difference. It would still be the same as original Vickrey setting, because I would, as an agent, essentially you can say, well, let's just run an auction at the time when uncertainty is resolved. And if uncertainty is never resolved, let's run it based on expected values. So that's not going to make a difference. What's important here is that you are in a position to take an action. And when you are taking an action that reduces or enhances the value of your object, that action itself is costly. It's an investment. So let me give you a very simple example of dynamic environment. You're shopping for a house, and you see a few houses that you like, right? And you see this house that you know is going to be auctioned off in 2 weeks. That's how the seller is doing it. And you think that you really like this house, but you really like the other house as well, and that other house that you like a little less. That will be auctioned in a week. So now you have to make a decision. Are you going to bid aggressively? Are you going to buy that house that you have to buy that you can buy in a week, or are you going to wait 2 weeks for the auction for this house that you really like? And the answer is, well, maybe there's another person who really, really likes that house that you really like, in which case you wouldn't be able to buy it because that person will outbid you, right? So you have to plan and decide. You have to make this agonizing decision. If you take this costly action, in this case not buying a house that's available, will be available in a week, in order to enhance your value for this house that you really like that will be auctioned 2 weeks from now. Unfortunately, you don't know the price that the house that you really like will go for. So if a couple of people decide to wait, only one of you will get it, and you will drop out at a certain price. Right? So we have to coordinate our actions in this dynamic uncertain environment. So you see the difference between the Vickrey setting and this one?
I think so.
Yeah. So the important part is that you take those costly actions.
I prescribe to the theory of decision analysis, which says you maximize your expected utility. So I don't see any. There's always uncertainty.
No.
There's no such thing as not having uncertainty.
Oh yes, So
Nothing is sure.
I agree that you maximize your expected utility, but what's important is that here the utility maximization problem is inherently dynamic. So let's think about it this way.
So I have my current set of expected values for.
You do, but you also have to plan your actions, right? So in the example with the house, you have to decide if you buy the house that is available in a week or not.
Right.
And that part doesn't fit in the Vickery setting, right? It doesn't fit in the traditional Vickery model. And the reason that it doesn't fit in the traditional Vickery model, because now you have, so in the Vickery model, you just specify at the time of the auction, you specify your value for each object that is available, right? So here, you have to specify the value for that house that will be for sale in 2 weeks. But that value changes over time.
No,
So that
the value for the thing that's being auctioned right now depends on the fact that there is another auction a week from now.
That's right.
But then I just fold all my probabilities into that, and I have a value for what
No.
this thing is
But
worth.
can everything
So-
be reduced to a net present value?
no, it could not be.
Why not?
So let me tell you why not in the most. Let me tell you why not in the most simple way. So suppose you have this object that's for sale in the future. So if you are selling it, it's an endogenous decision when you. So suppose you decide to sell it using an auction, right? And no, this is only one object, so it's very simple, right? So suppose you decide to sell it using an auction. So if you use an auction, Vickery auction for one object is just a second price auction. Agreed? So suppose you decide to sell it using second price auction. So in the Vickery setting, of course, there is no time. So it shouldn't matter when you sell that. In this setting, it would make a great deal of difference when you sell it. Because suppose that at time 0, you never took the action nor saw later signals that you receive. So if you sell it at time 0, the person who will buy it would not necessarily be the person who will get high signals in the future, who would have high value at the end of the day. Because your value will change over time, right? So there's some random draw to your value that will occur in the future. However, if the person who will buy it at time 0, he will make appropriate investments to enhance his value. So if you sell it at time 0, in fact, with probability 1, there's a possibility you get an inefficient allocation, because there's a possibility that whoever has the highest expected value at time 0 will later get huge negative shocks. And no, this is before the object becomes available, right? Will have huge negative shocks to his value. And as a result, at the time when the object becomes available, the person who actually bought the object doesn't even have the highest value for the object. So that's not an efficient outcome. That's clearly inconsistent with Vickery. So you can tell me, hey, maybe I'm doing just a stupid thing here. I shouldn't be selling it at time 0 before all uncertainty is resolved, right? If I'm selling it at time 0 when uncertainty isn't resolved, I'm just shooting myself in the foot, right? I should simply wait till the object becomes available and sell it then while all uncertainty is resolved. Would that be an efficient outcome? The answer is no. And here's why the answer is no. Suppose that, again, I use second price auction, second price Vickery auction right before the object becomes available. At that time, all uncertainty is resolved. And at that time, all agents already made the investments they had to make that changed the value. So when they were making those investments, they had no idea what were the values of other people and how likely they were to win. So they might have dramatically underinvested. So the agent who wins the object at this auction very well might have neglected to take an action that could have enhanced costly investment, that could have enhanced his value for the object. Right? So for example, suppose in the very beginning, I think, well, gee, my value is so low, it's so unlikely that I will actually win this house, win this object, that I will not make investments that will enhance my value. And each agent, in fact, it so happened that all 3 agents who participated in this auction, they had low value, unusually low value. So none of them thought they're likely to win. As a result, none of them invested in costly actions that enhance the value. And as a result, one of them who actually wins the object says, oh my God, if I would have known how low were the values of other guys, if I would have known that I will win this object, of course I would have invested more. So that's where there's a difference with Vickery.
Let me try to reframe it.
Yeah.
So imagine you're the person that owns the thing, and you have to decide when to hold the auction. Now you know that you you know there's these different players. You may not even know who the players are, but you have a probability distribution over who these players are. You have a probability distribution over what their values are going to be, and now you just pick the time to have the option maximizes your expected value.
That's a possibility, and what this paper shows.
Go to the military base. What if you you own the military base, but you know there's another country over here that might take
Right.
you over within 5 years, and so there's some uncertainty whether if you wait a year to auction the military base, if you're even going to have a military base to auction. So now you've got all these.
Well, I mean, we make certain, as any model, we make certain assumptions. So the assumption is the military base will be there, and we know that it will be available. So that's not.
It's really just a decision where the person who owns the item that's
Right.
being auctioned decide when to
So,
hold the auction.
so I'm really glad you mentioned it, because you said, look, there's a person who owns the object, and I realized that because of dynamic nature of the environment, it's not revenue equivalent when you choose to hold an auction, which is correct. And
The
let
right
me
answer is not necessarily to
let
sell
me-
it at the last possible minute.
exactly. So, but let me finish, because you may be surprised with the answer. And then you said something else that's very interesting. You said, look, there are all those points in time when you can run the auction. They will bring different revenues. So what you should find out the optimal time to hold the auction. And what this paper shows, that this is not the best you can do. This is not. And here's why. The optimal thing to do would be to use a multi-stage mechanism where instead of running the auction, in fact, the traditional auction, the second price auction, the victory auction, will not be an optimal efficient procedure for selling this object. The efficient procedure would run a multi-round mechanism where in the beginning we have a preliminary round of bidding that is binding and important, so that all bidders get some information about each other's values, and that helps them to make efficient actions in the future. And then you have a second round where you finally allocate the object. And that would be shown strictly better than just running one auction at an optimal time. Yes, I will.
Because you got the guy selling the stuff.
Yes.
The people buying money.
Exactly. So let me go to a formal model, and you will see how it works. So let me spend a couple of minutes on the roadmap. So I will start out with giving you a formal model of dynamic environment, which will be a very simple model. In fact, an example of a dynamic environment that's simple and tractable and I can solve. Then we'll talk about social planner problem. What is the first best? In other words, what is the total? What is the mechanism that would allocation that would maximize the total surplus of all agents, assuming that there are no incentive problems and they sort of truthfully reveal to a computer that runs optimization problem all the private information, which is unrealistic. And then we'll go to an auction design that in fact creates a mechanism that forces agents to be truthful and to reveal the information and still implements the efficient thing. So I will show an efficient auction design in dynamic environment, and I will also show, if I have time, something I call epsilon efficient mechanism that essentially makes it this implementation problem more robust. So here's a formal model. Agents receive signals, SI, at time 0 in period 1. And those signals are basically some non-negative signals. And those signals are all drawn from the same probability distribution, and those are IID draws. In period 2, each agent might take an unobservable action. So, for example, action could be 0 or 1. Or, in fact, we can allow actions to be any number between 0 and 1. That's OK. And that action increases the agent's private value later on, private value for the object. But at the same time, the action is costly. It costs C. So total cost of action for an agent is C multiplied by A. So if you took an action, that's like an investment into that object, but then you ended up not buying it, then you regret taking the action because you lost some money and got nothing in exchange.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is atomless synonymous with IID?
No, no. Atomless means that there are no delta functions in there. So it's continuous. Let's see. Yes. And IID means independent and identical draws. So finally we go to period 3. And in period 3, agents receive independent signals. So it's another set of independent signals that we call TI. And those are, again, signals about the private values. And in fact, so here we have the most general setting for those signals. But in fact, you can think of those third period signals as simply independent, again, independent draws from some other distribution, again, IID, again, atomless. And agent's I private value for the object is going to be equal to some function of SI and TI. So the first signal that you receive in the first period, and the signal that you receive in the third period. And it's an increasing function in both arguments, plus B multiplied by A. So in other words, if action is binary, 0, 1, then that action increased your value by B if you took it and didn't do anything to your value if you didn't. The simplest form of this function would simply be SI plus TI. So you can think about this expression as if you didn't take an action, your value for the object is going to be SI plus TI. If you took the action, the value for the object for agent I will be SI plus TI plus A. Well, plus B, I'm sorry.
And BI is the same across all agents?
There is no BI. B is the same. Yeah, B is the same. Yes. So this is a formal model, and you see how it does not, how there is no way to sort of map this into standard Vickers setting.
So what's the importance of so the signals are always telling you better?
Yes.
Right?
The higher is the signal, the better it is. Right? Signals are not binary; they are from continuous distribution.
But so I'm curious about the assumption that given SI, the dominance of the second distribution.
So let's forget. So just to make it simpler, so dominance is the most general assumption. But let's suppose that both of them are simply independent. So that's particular case of dominance.
Yep.
So that assumption is a very good assumption because it makes things tractable and it allows us to sort of see clearly what happens there. So this is simply the utility function, the payoff function of the players. So now I fully describe. So note that your utility as an agent is simply, if you got the object, it's your value for the object, right? In the simplest sense, SI plus TI plus B if you took the action and plus nothing if you didn't, minus C, which is the cost of action if you took the action, and minus nothing if you didn't, minus whatever you paid to get the object, right? So, and if you didn't get the object, then your utility is equal to whatever you paid for investments, which could be 0. Maybe you didn't take any costly actions. So A could be 0 or could be 1 or in between, minus whatever you have to pay, right? It could be that you played the game, you got to pay something to play the game, and you thought you might win, that's why you were willing to do it, but it turns out that now you regret it because you paid something and didn't get the object. We allow for that. So this is a formal description of the model.
Are you assuming the auction has to take place now?
No. It can take place anywhere. I fully described the environment.
Who decides when it takes place?
The auctioneer, the owner of the object, can design any mechanism he wants given the constraints of this environment.
What are the owner's beliefs about optimizing his return on the...
So what we will do here, so we'll actually take, we'll look at efficiency, which is actually closely related to optimality. So and I'll, in a second, I'll define what an efficient allocation is. And then we'll look at a set of all possible mechanisms, and we'll see that, for instance, running an auction at period 1 or running an auction in period 3 would not be efficient, generally speaking, and it will be efficient to have a 2-round mechanism. And we are sort of taking, in some sense, a mechanism design approach. So we are considering the set of all possible mechanisms, and we show that they exist an efficient one. So let me define what I mean by efficiency, because I'm sure this is the question that sort of pops up in your mind. So social surplus is the value of the object to the agent that gets the object minus the cost of actions taken by by all agents, right? So that's sort of, if you go back, for instance, to the example of the person coming into town or a chemical factory being built. Remember, the notion of efficiency that we had there if the value, we were sort of summing up the utilities of all agents, and we were saying it's efficient if we maximize the sum of utilities of all agents. So here the definition is exactly the same. It's efficient if we maximized the sum of utilities of all agents. Yes?
Where's the payments for the losers? Why isn't that part of it? Why isn't the payment?
Oh, that's a very good question. And the reason why the payments from the losers are not important, because those are transfers, right? So if I'm paying something, someone else receives it.
For society.
So if you maximize the sum of utilities, my payment to you decreases my utility on by 3 if I paid you $3, and increases your utility by 3 if you receive $3. So all the payments cancel out here. So what's important are the sort of real payoffs, and payments will all cancel. And of course that works. That's sort of standard.
Is it, so it's implicit here that the auctioneer is getting about all these payments, and that's
Oh yeah,
balanced.
auctioneer gets all the payments, of course. Who else will? Right? So this is the idea.
But an explicit way to write that is to have this equation, then you subtract off the payments, and then you add the value to the auctioneer, which is the sum of the payments.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. So note that, so we have a definition of social surplus for now. So let's define what it means let's define what we mean by an allocation. So allocation is a vector consisting of the list of agents who took actions, because that's important. That's a real thing. That's not a transfer. Because once I take an action, I basically sunk an investment that costs C to me, and that nobody else gets. It's just wasted if I didn't get the object. Right? So it's a list of all agents who took actions and their identities, and the identity of the agents who received the object. That's an allocation. And once we know how many actions were taken and what was the value of the person who received the object, we know total social surplus. So if you take any mechanism, any game, an equilibrium strategy profile of a mechanism, for example, an auction, will be referred to an allocation rule. And we'll say that allocation rule is efficient, that is first best. And it's not necessarily the case that there exists an efficient allocation rule. In fact, we can come up with examples of dynamic environment where efficient allocation rule will not exist, but in this particular example, it will exist. So an allocation rule is efficient and first best if it yields the same accepted social surplus as the maximum expected social surplus that could be achieved by a social planner, that is to say, by a computer that solves the dynamic optimization problem, where that social planner knows all the information available to agents at the time when social planner makes a decision. In other words, our social planner, at the time when it's time for agents to take the actions, he knows the value of the first signal, because agents know the value of the first signal when they take an action or not take an action. However, the social planner does not know and couldn't condition his decisions on the value of the second signal, because the second signal, signal T, simply is not yet available, not known to agents at the time when they have to make an investment. So this is the definition of efficient allocation rule. So it's useful to introduce a function that we call GI that represents the difference in expected social surplus that results from agents acting or not acting, keeping the action of all other agents unchanged. So in other words, this again goes back to the idea of externality, right? If I took an action, obviously my payoffs in the mechanism would change, but who cares? This function just tells you the change in the total social surplus. So here's a very simple theorem. I'm embarrassed to call it a theorem. For a given vector of the first period of private signals S, there exists a threshold level R star such that social planner will assign all agents who have first period signals higher than R star to take actions, and the social planner will assign all the agents with signal below not R star not to take action. And that sort of, I think, goes back to the question that you were asking, how is it different from an auction? And the idea is that, well, we know that what a social planner would like to do, he would like to condition the actions, the investments, on the first period signals. But then he would like to allocate the object based on third period signals. So you want somehow to have a mechanism where when agents take independently and in a decentralized fashion their intermediate actions, the investments, that they know something about each other's first period signal, but yet you're not yet committed to how you would allocate the object, and you would allocate it with the knowledge of all the information when third period signals are obtained. And that's why we actually, it would be a second best to use a one-time auction.
So I assume that you're going to, the people who have signals higher are themselves going to be incented to act?
Yes, exactly. That's what we will try to do, and we will have to make sure that people will be willing to reveal their first period signals. But before we'll go there, I will solve a much simpler problem, which is not at all obvious problem, actually. So here is a theorem. Suppose that first period signals are observable, at common knowledge, right? So everybody gets a draw, everybody has a signal, and we all know what the signals are. And I know not only my signal, but also your signal. It's a very unrealistic assumption, but it's interesting to consider this case. In 3 minutes, I'll drop that assumption. So in that case, there exists a socially efficient subgame perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium if we do the following. If in the last period, after the signals are revealed, we simply run a second price auction. So that sort of goes back to your idea that you should just run a second price auction. And in fact, it's true in this case. And agents will efficiently coordinate on actions miraculously. That will no longer be true once signals become private information. We'll have to do something different. So note that this is sort of somewhat surprising, because think about it. So what we are doing now, in the third, after the second signals are observed, at the end of the game, we run a second price auction. Now I'm deciding to take or not to take an action, and I know everybody else's signals. So when I take an action, I impose externality on all other guys, because once I took an action, I'll bid higher in a second price auction. In fact, I will bid my true value in the second price auction. So since I'm going to bid higher, I'm imposing externality on other people, and when they decide to take or not to take an action, they also impose externality on me and on the seller as well. So it's not at all obvious that we'll take efficient actions. You could imagine that we'll take too many or too few. So here is a lemma that makes this theorem work. If we define function gi as the change in expected utility of agent I as a result of taking the action, then it turns out that the change in his expected personal payoff is exactly equal to the externality that he imposes on other agents by taking an action. Note that this is something that does not follow from VCG construction, because here all we are using second price auction in the last period. So it's by no means follows. And in some sense, I think it's surprising. Why does it work? But it does. And instead of providing a sort of formal proof, I'll just give you an intuition for the proof that I think conveys the main idea. So let's for a second suppose that action that you can take is sort of continuous from 0 to 1. And suppose that instead of increasing, so here we are increasing action from 0 to 1. But suppose that I increase my action just a little bit. And I was planning to take action 0.5, so my investment size, if you wish, was 0.5. I'm thinking of slightly increasing it. So if I slightly increased it, just slightly, the probability that I am a highest bidder or not highest bidder almost doesn't change. It's a second order effect. So when I win the auction, the payment that I make doesn't change, of course, right? But my utility increases, by this amount B minus C multiplied by this epsilon, right? When I lose an auction, I basically I just wasted the action. So it's easy to connect the probability of me winning the auction to my payoff from taking this action. And basically, it's pretty easy to see from there that the externality that you impose on other agents is going to be exactly equal to the change in your payoff. Maybe that wasn't a coherent argument, but since I have 10 minutes, I should probably skip it. The proof, the rigorous proof, is in the paper, and this is in fact not the main result of the paper. So let me go to the main result. So now let's consider a more interesting world. Let's consider a world where first period signals are in fact private information. So now it's easy to see that you could never have a one-round mechanism that is efficient. Why could it never happen? It could never happen because we know that an efficient mechanism, your decision to take or not to undertake or not to undertake an investment should depend on values of first period signals of other people. It must be the case, right? And we had a theorem that was saying exactly that. We had a theorem that was saying, well, if a mechanism is efficient, everybody with very high signals should take actions. And everybody with low signals shouldn't take an action. And that itself, the threshold level, would depend on what are the signals of everybody. So, for example, it's easy to imagine that if there are a couple of two agents, and both of them has incredibly low values of the first period signal, the guy with the higher value may have to take an action. But of course, how would he know that he's the guy with the higher value unless he knows something about the value of the other guy? So the question is, how do we design a mechanism where we get full revelation of the signals, efficient actions, and efficient allocation of the object? And here's how we do it. Let me first just give you the intuition that drives the result, and then I'll talk about the result. The intuition is the following. Suppose that you are a person with high value, with high first period signal. And suppose that at a cost, you can announce that your signal is high. Would you want to do it? Would you want other people to know what your signal is? And the answer is you will want to know. You will want other people to know, because if they know that your value is very high, that would possibly discourage them from undertaking investments. And if they don't undertake investments, then they will bid lower in the following round. And if they bid lower in the following round, the price that you will have to pay would be lower, right? So if I could say, oh, the value of my signal is gazillion, you guys are out of the game. It's just no hope you are winning. None of those guys would undertake investments, so I'll get it for song. So that's true. So everybody wants to say that the signals have high value.
So you're not revealing your price. You're just revealing the fact that your price just went up.
Your signal. You don't know your full everything about your value yet, but you're revealing something about your value. Everything you know.
Else, my value
Right.
just went up.
Right.
Or it went up a lot.
Yeah.
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 Price.
But there's one problem with this, because suppose that my value is in fact very low. I still want everybody to think that my value is very high, and maybe I'll still manage to get it for a song. So that doesn't. So just the fact that everybody would like to say that the value is high doesn't do the trick.
But you're
But
not saying your value is high. You're saying my value is higher than it was before.
well, I mean, in this setting, actually, there is no before, right? You just get a draw of a signal, and
Before the draw of the signal.
right.
I had a value before the signal. I have a value after the signal.
Yes. So we,
My value is
implicitly we assume that I mean,
not saying what your value is.
right. So implicitly here, basically, before the signals are drawn, everybody has the same values. Or, in fact, in this model, people aren't born even before they got the signals. They're sort of born with those signals, right? So
It's just the first
So you
bet.
are giving out your value.
It's the first bet in a poker game, right?
exactly. Thank
You
you.
want people to fold.
Thank you.
Well,
So
it's important whether you're giving out your value or your delta value. And it sounds like you're giving out your actual value here.
Well, in some sense, you're
Zero, so
If
the
everybody
delta is
starts from the
effectively-
same value and you give out your deltas, then you're giving out
Yes.
your value.
exactly. Thank
So
you.
how's that? This is not anywhere near a second price auction anymore.
Oh, no.
Everybody knows their values.
No, he's just talking about the incentives. They have
I'm
incentives
thinking about
to
incentives.
reveal-
Yeah.
there's
Exactly.
incentives to reveal high, but then you've got to. He has told us about how he's
Right.
going to lock them into
Exactly.
doing
That's,
something.
that's their value with zero knowledge about their probability of winning.
Say it again. I'm sorry.
That's their value without any idea of their probability of winning it. But after the first signal, they'll have some kind of idea and they can know how to value the improvements.
Exactly. So, so know that so far everybody basically wants to bluff. So if you were just to send a questionnaire saying how high is your first period signal, everybody would say sky high, and that wouldn't help. But now I say, wait a second. Suppose that my value is really sky high, and someone else's value is really rock bottom, like 0, very low, awful draw. So who is willing to pay more to make other people truly believe that his value is sky high? The guy whose value is truly sky high, or the guy whose value is truly rock bottom? And sort of pretty easy to see, and that's what we show formally mathematically, is like a very messy proof of a lemma that shows that in fact the guy with the value truly sky high would benefit much more from convincing other people that his value truly sky high than the guy with value rock bottom. And the intuition is very simple. Suppose that I'm the guy with the value rock bottom, and I convince everybody that my value is truly sky high. So even if they are convinced that my value is sky high, what did they do? They didn't take costly actions. But then they did a third round of signals, so they got some draws. So even though they're handicapped because they didn't take a costly action, they still, even without those costly actions, they still may be ahead of me. They may still win the auction, and I will lose the auction, right? So the fact that I discourage them from taking those costly actions and driving up the price with high probability doesn't do any good to me, because I don't win with high probability in spite of the fact that I sort of fooled other people and handicapped them a little bit. However, if my value is truly sky high, I win with very, very high probability. So if other people neglected to take costly investments, that reduces the price I pay with probability that is very, very high. And that is why I'm willing to pay a lot more. And that's what makes this mechanism work. So here's how it works. Basically, in the first round, agents are asked to announce what the signals are. And they may be lying. Then the auctioneer announces sort of what were the announcements he received. He said, look, I got very strong interest from Chris. He claims he is 10. I got moderate interest from Max, 5, and so on and so forth, right? So everybody learns essentially what values of other people are. But how does auctioneer makes it credible? The rules of the game are the following. Everybody would have to make a payment that is a function of his announcement and announcements of all other people. And we will see how those, and we will show that there exists a set of payments that would make those announcements credible, and that would ensure that people would be willing to, in fact, announce the value truthfully, and knowing that they will have to pay if the announcement discouraged other people from taking costly actions. And what we will make sure, we will show that there exists a mechanism where people pay essentially exactly the externality that they imposed on others, if you wish, and that would give us an opportunity to create an efficient mechanism. So the way the mechanism actually works, first everybody announces their signals, and they may be lying. Second, they're asked to write checks based on everybody's announcements. And if someone refuses to write a check, then I was kidding, then that person his signal is assumed to be 0 by everybody else. Or in fact, we can have a game where it's actually binding. When I announce my signal, I will actually legally have to make a payment. By rules of the mechanism, I have to make a payment. And if I announce that my signal is 0, then I'm guaranteed that I pay 0. But if I make a positive announcement, I have to pay for that announcement. And the payment would be a function of everybody else's announcements. Then agents take actions, and they take actions based on the information they learn. They're free agents. They can do whatever they want. Then finally, in the second round, after the second signals were observed, we simply run a second price auction. second price sealed bid auction, and allocate the object. And it turns out that this mechanism will be efficient.
So I'm a little bit confused about what the role of the check is. So is that cashed by the auctioneer, or is that just
It's cash received by the auctioneer.
and what's my value for? Okay, you'll tell us a bit more about that check. Yes. Or
Yes, let me tell you about the check now. So the idea, is the question why you are willing to write that check?
Yeah. I mean,
So that check is a signaling payment, because note that check entitles you to nothing. You didn't buy anything. The only thing you did, the rules of the game are as following: make an announcement, announce your signal. If you announce that your signal is 0, then you pay 0, and that's the rules of the game, and that's fine. And then later on, you can still buy the object. That's fine. But if you say, oh, my signal is high, and I say, okay, I got one sky high signal, one medium, one this is the payment you have to make. And there's a formula pre-announced in advance that tells us what your payment would have to be. So now you are on the hook for this payment. So you're asking, why would I ever agree to announce a signal that's bigger than 0 if I'm basically paying something for nothing? Because the fact that I wrote this check entitles me to nothing. And the reason is you are willing to make this payment because you want to convince other people that you are a serious buyer with high value. And that would reduce the price you will have to pay later on, because it would discourage them from making investments, and those investments, of course, would have driven up the price that you would have to pay should you win. So did it answer the question, or you were asking something else? Okay. So here's a theorem. There exists a subgame perfect Bayesian Nash equilibrium of the signaling mechanism described above that yields an efficient allocation rule. So we just created a mechanism that turns out to be not one auction but two-round mechanism where all the information is revealed, and it is as if we have everything that's being sort of centrally maximized and so on and so forth. This is, I think, pretty nice. We can also show that, and this is the lemma that I mentioned to you, that essentially what happens is that there is something we call single crossing condition, that people with higher value, they're willing to pay more to signal that they have high values. And that's what drives this equilibrium. That's how we derive that result. And I will completely skip the proofs. Essentially, the way we verify that something is in equilibrium, we just write incentive compatibility and individual rationality condition. And we show that that mechanism satisfies both of them. An incentive compatibility condition basically says, given what you are doing there, if you were to make any other announcement, you would be worse off or you wouldn't be better off. So an individual rationality condition is that we know that you could ensure that your payoff is 0 by simply paying nothing and not playing the game. So we have to ensure that your payoff is at least as high as that from basically abstaining from playing. We allow you to do that. So here in this theorem, we in fact characterize what are the payments that agents have to make in this mechanism. And the way the payments would work here is very similar to VCG construction. And I will not describe it in the details, but I'll just tell you the intuition, which I think might be revealing. So here's what we do. We say, OK, suppose that your signal were 0. Suppose that if your signal were 0, there will be K-star agents, where K-star is some number, say 4, there are 10 of us. So if your signal were 0 and were believed by others to be 0, and everybody else's signals were whatever the true signals were, there would be 4 agents who would take actions. So if you convince other people that your signal is not 0, that your value is not rock bottom but higher, the number of agents who take action other than you may drop, maybe 3 instead of 4, right? So here is the rule. If your signal, if you announce a signal that says, oh, my value is 3, and the number of agents who take actions is 4, same as if your signal were 0, so you were not pivotal, right? You didn't impose any externalities on any actions, because you announced that your value is 3, but if you would have announced 0, exactly the same people would take exactly the same actions. Then your signaling payment will be 0. Because your announcement really didn't do you any good. Didn't do you any bad, but didn't really do you any good. So we ask you to pay nothing. So now, so those S bar, they basically correspond to those pivotal signal announcements where at S bar, if you announce a little bit higher signal than S bar, then suddenly the number of people who take actions drop by 1, right? So then you say, okay, suppose that your signaling payment is, suppose that your type, you announce the type that just high enough to make the number of people who take actions drop from 4 to 3, other than you, of course, maybe you took an action, but the number of people who take action just dropped from 4 to 3 just because you increased your announcement. So that clearly benefited you. So we set your signaling payment such that if your true value indeed is such that it's exactly at the level of signal that dropped the number of people who act from 4 to 3, then you would be exactly indifferent. So now you would, in expectation benefit, you would pay less in the final auction. So what we'll ask you to pay for the signal to make it credible is exactly equal to the reduction in payment that you would have to make at the final auction because there was this one person who dropped out. So now there is again a range of signals where you keep increasing your signal, but there are still exactly 3 people who act. And then we just charge you the same as if your signal was the lost signal that's necessary to discourage just one person from acting. So that's how we compute those payment structures. So it sort of goes like this. Yes?
Isn't it possible that as a result of somebody raising their announcement that I will perform the action? So the scenario, and maybe this is probably impossible, but the scenario is the payment that I pay is exactly canceled out by the value that I get. But if somebody's close to me, I may want to pay, see if I'm going to win or not.
No, wouldn't happen. Wouldn't happen. Yeah.
Okay.
So it is possible, but we can prove that it wouldn't be happening. So then this is another theorem that shows that there is in fact more than one efficient mechanism. And in fact, in the mechanism that I described, how much time do I have? Like 3 minutes, or am I out of time? Huh?
I think that it'd be good to start wrapping up, but you can keep
Okay,
going for a while.
I need about 3-4 minutes. So what this theorem basically tells us, it says, look, in the previous mechanism, what was very nice is that mechanism was something we call ex post mechanism. It was ex post in the sense that whatever my announcement was, I never regretted my announcement. Even though I was making this payment, even if I were told, look, now you're on the hook for this payment, but guess what? You don't have to make this payment. You can change your announcement. Do you want to change it? I would say no, because I'm paying exactly sort of what I gained from discouraging people. And that was nice. However, it was also a little uncomfortable because the payments, the signaling payments that you make, had to depend on announcements of everybody else, which is a little bizarre. So could we have a mechanism where it wouldn't be the case, where the payment you make only depends on your own type? And then the answer is yes, you can. And this is the mechanism. Suppose that now we change a little bit. So there exists another equilibrium where basically everybody doesn't announce his signal, but simply writes a check. He says, I am signaling, or maybe announces his signal, but it's cheap talk. He says, my value is this, and here's the check to prove it. So that's no longer going to be ex post mechanism, but would also be Bayesian-Nash equilibrium with truthful revelation. And essentially, those checks, so note that in the previous mechanism, your payment was a function of everybody else's payments. So here, your payment is your expected payment in the previous mechanism. And it turns out that you still get truthful revelation this way, even though you make a signal, just one payment. That only depends on your signal, but doesn't your announcement, but not on announcements of other people. And it's again quite intuitive. You say, look, in expectation, if I convince other people my value is high and I know it is high, my benefit is high. So of course, sometimes this is no longer an ex post mechanism. So sometimes I write this check and I say, darn, everybody else's values were so low they wouldn't have taken actions anyway, and I signaled an arm and a leg to convince them. But sometimes it would be the other way around. You would say, oh, thanks God, I signaled relatively cheaply. So on average, you would be indifferent. And since you don't know what other people's signals are when you write the check, it would still be in equilibrium, right? And then,
so if I'm deciding what amount to write in my check, I need to be understanding this expectation, right?
You need to be understanding what?
So okay, so the object has certain value to me, right? And I need to map from that value to an amount that I signal with my check.
Yes.
So I need to kind of in my head think about all the other players and,
Right.
and do this expectation.
Right, right. So of course, in the ideal world, you have to do all those expectations, but you can imagine that in the real world, you could, in fact, just sort of say, well, my value is very high, so I'm willing to signal a lot, make a lot of effort to show that my value is high, and we'll just approximately gauge things, and things would be approximately efficient. And this is what epsilon efficient auction does. So here we make this mechanism sufficiently robust that it could conceivably be used in practice. And here's how it works. You sell using an all-pay auction. By the way, do you know what all-pay auction is? All-pay auction is the following. Everybody basically puts some money in the envelope, and that's their bids. But in a traditional auction, you only pay your bid if you get the object. So in an all-pay auction, you pay your bid no matter what, and the highest bidder gets the object. So you sell a small discount, a discount of size epsilon, that could be used in the auction where the object will be sold, using an all-pay auction. So now there are real money in stake, not much, epsilon discount, it's like a coupon, and we are bidding in all-pay auction. So note that intuitively it's pretty obvious that if my value is very high, I'm willing to pay a lot more for this discount than if my value is very low. Then there's an added bonus. I say, not only I will get this discount, which is not worth that much, but I will also, since my bid will be announced to everybody, I will also convince the community to stay away that my value is so high, so my bid would also serve the signaling purpose. So it turns out that if you have this epsilon, if you auction off the small discount, then for a sufficiently small discount, you get arbitrarily close to an efficient equilibrium. That's why I call it robust epsilon efficient auction. Basically, the theorem says that yes, there is robust equilibrium in this game, and in fact, it's a unique equilibrium, unique robust equilibrium. And it yields efficient allocation with probability arbitrarily close to 1 as epsilon goes to 0. And that pretty much completes the paper. So the main message of this paper, I think, is that first, there are plenty of dynamic auction environments out there. In fact, almost every